Well, I'm a librarian. So, with when someone, even though someone that you've read over time as a New York Times book review editor and things, you knew her name, but when she came out with How to Raise a Reader, I was just ecstatic. And the last time, in fact, I was here at 3 years ago at this festival, I got a chance to be in conversation with you. So thank you for that. Louder. Remember, I'm a librarian. Okay. And we are actually in a library, and it's so wonderful because they took out all the shelves and everything. But this is one of the only festivals, I believe, that takes place in a physical library. So, personal favorite, How to Raise a Reader. I have to ask you, in front of everybody, what kind of reader were you?
Well, I want to just start by saying this is so fantastic that Carla is able to turn the tables on me because last time I interviewed her. And I also want to just make a plug for the Library of Congress because she's sort of very humbly saying that she's a librarian, but she is a librarian of
Well,
one of the greatest libraries in the world. And if you have not been inside the Library of Congress, I urge you to go inside and, if possible, get a little tour around. It's not really for us; it's for Congress, but
it is
the
for
whole building
everybody.
is for everyone.
We'll
There,
talk about that later.
all
It's
right.
for everyone, and we want you to know that. So,
I was, interestingly, especially given How to Raise a Reader, I did not have a lot of books as a child. I had the kind of parents who said, when I wanted a book, they said, go to the library. But I was really lucky because my local library was within walking distance, and this was an era in which, 7-year-olds were allowed to go out and walk by themselves to go to the library, and it was also across the street from my elementary school. So what I would do after school was just, instead of going home, immediately go into the library, and I basically inhabited that library as a child, and I was there so regularly that I felt that I should be employed by the library. So I asked the librarian in the children's library if I could work there. And, I was 8, I think, or 9. And so they, turned down my offer of employment. And when I said, like, you wouldn't have to pay me, I think, like, that's what really scared them off. They were just like,
who is
um,
this kid?
yeah. But I remember that library because my favorite thing in the library was actually the wall of biography. So my last event here was interviewing biographers here at the festival, which was such a treat for me because, as Doug Brinkley said, as a child, for me, biographies were a kind of guide. I felt like that was my self-help as a child. I sort of looked at the wall of biographies, and there weren't many biographies of girls, of women. So I learned how to be a nurse, Florence Nightingale or Clara Barton, or
Clara
First
Barton.
Lady, Dolly Madison, or Eleanor Roosevelt. But actually, the one who inspired me the most as a child was Helen Keller, because as a shy and awkward child, uh, any challenge that I had in my life felt really minuscule to what she faced as a child. So for me, books became a kind of way of inhabiting another viewpoint, another life, another world. And that was how I read as a child. And honestly, that's how I continue to read. I read to be sort of transported out of my own world and reinserted into someone else's, whether it's a biography or a novel or a work of science fiction where it's just an alternate world, because I think of reading as a way to get to see the world in a light that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to see, whether it's because it's something that took place in the past, and who among us, can be a coal miner in 19th century France, as in Zola's Germinal, or whether it's, living in a world that doesn't exist, as in one of my favorite books as a child was A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. So that's how I've always read. And when I think about what I want to read next, I often think, like, where do I want to be? Because that's when you read, that is, you're sort of choosing in terms of your day, what you're going to be exposed to, where you want to actually be elsewhere in your mind for a portion of that day.
The Paris Library. I know where I want to be. I hadn't thought about it like that. Got some good stuff to come. So you just immersed yourself.
Yeah.
And when you wrote this book, I'm sure people, the question they ask you when they say, oh, you're the lady that did How to Raise a Reader, and you're in the hallway or you're on that elevator or they recognize you and they say, tell me how I can get my child to read, or what are your top 10 tips, or my grandchild seems to be stuck on a thing, that moves. How can I get him interested in books?
Well, it's a whole book. But
Yeah,
I'll,
get the book.
I'll give a few kind of overriding ideas because, even in that question, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of worry, there's a fear that your child either won't be able to read, so that's one half of it, and then the other part of it is that your child won't want to read, which is the device part of it. And so I'll answer the first question, and then we'll go to the second point. But in terms of your child learning how to read, that's not your job as the parent, as the grandparent, as a caregiver. That's the teacher's job. And it's a really important job, but all kids, and even children who have some kind of reading disability or, in terms of decoding or dyslexia, they eventually will learn to read, and that's on the part of professionals. The job of the parent is very different, and that is teaching your children how to love to read. And it takes an enormous amount of pressure off of parents, I think, once you realize that, because it's not on you to be correcting them as they read. It's not on you to worry about, are they reading at the right time? Is it too late? Are they behind? That's the teacher's job. And teaching your child how to love to read is actually a lot more fun. And the process, the mood as a parent then is one of, you are giving your child, you're basically opening up this world to them. That's a huge opportunity. So it's not a question of like, I need to get my child to eat broccoli. And once you shift your mind to, no, I am like laying out a banquet of dessert, and I am showing them this world, and I am letting them, gorge themselves here. And then I have a lot of tips as to sort of how you go towards the love as opposed to the have to. And the other part of that too is that parents often worry about, is my child reading soon enough? And I think that, our education system, which is very metrics focused, and teachers are under a lot of pressure, so I'm not faulting them here. The pressure is on kids to read by kindergarten or to read by first grade and to be at a certain level, and you'll often hear, what letter they're on in terms of, are they level D versus level G, and the kids absorb that too, right? So they're feeling a kind of pressure that, other kids are ahead of them. But research shows that the age at which you start to read has nothing to do with whether you become a lifelong reader. And of my 3 children, I would say that my older son, my middle child, probably read the latest of the 3, and he is the most ambitious, most voracious reader. And in fact, in parts of Northern Europe in particular, they don't start to teach reading until age 8. And in Germany, and the reason they don't is that the brain isn't necessarily ready to read at a very young age. There's a lot of sort of mechanical things that have to take place in terms of development, particularly with boys. And so if you try to teach children earlier than their brains are ready, it becomes an extremely frustrating experience, and the child absorbs a message of like, well, I'm not good at this, I can't do this, so it feels negative. And again, there are tricks that you can do as a parent to kind of offset that. If your child is absorbing that message at school, you then need to make it all the more an experience of joy, and to focus not on them reading necessarily, but on you reading to them. And the other component about that I tell people to bear in mind is it's like tying your shoelaces, right? Like everyone eventually learns to tie their shoelaces. Some kids can do it at age 4, and some don't figure it out until 10. However, the ones that started at age 4 are no better at it as adults than the ones who didn't do it until age 10.
And that's very comforting.
Yes, yes. It has to do with, the motor skills and the development. So the second part of that, this is a long answer, but it's a big question, is, well, then how do you teach them, ultimately when they get devices and they have other things to entertain themselves, if they don't love to read, if they don't want to read, they're not going to, because they have a lot of other choices. So to get back to, my childhood, the reason I went to the library after school is like, it wasn't that fun at home. We had a TV with like 3 channels. My brothers always had, before the remote control, they at least had like power over the dial, and they were bigger and stronger than me, and the options were like Gilligan's Island and the Brady Bunch, so it wasn't that exciting. We didn't have computers, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have video games, so reading was really one of the best, to my mind, the best choice, the best option for how to spend my time. But today, kids have so many more options of what they're going to do, and so if they don't learn to want to read, as opposed to going on TikTok, going on Instagram, going on the Wii, watching a million streaming channels on their devices, then they're not going to do that, which is all the more reason why it has to become, you need to focus on developing an intrinsic motivation for the child to read as opposed to an extrinsic motivation. I'm just going to dwell on that for 1 second, because the extrinsic motivation, I think a lot of parents will mistakenly focus on. Like, one of the worst things I think to do is be like, if you finish this book, you can play on the iPad. So what are we telling kids? Like, do this really boring, awful thing, and then you get to do the fun thing. Or giving money for reading, as if the reading in and of itself that's the reward, right? So if you are not instilling and inculcating that sense of joy in reading, then when they have the opportunity, when it's no longer, as a parent at a certain point, you kind of lose control over the way your children are spending their free time. When it becomes in, their control, and in order to develop that love of reading for life, they're not going to choose it.
You mentioned 2 things, broccoli and boys. Now, the broccoli part, and I would substitute, my mom's in the room, Brussels sprouts. Book, like it's, ugh, and you have to finish the book. Even if you don't like it, you talk about book guilt and freeing people. And I know how many of the people in the audience feel that and were raised to, you have to finish this book. You have to. So right there, you're like, but I hate this book, but I have to finish it. So there's book guilt. As a librarian, you don't. There are millions of books. Put it down. Find one you like. So you agree?
I do agree. And a corollary to that is, especially as a parent, like, don't judge your children's books, right? Do not judge your children's books, and this goes to boys too, because a lot of us are like, read this fabulous novel. Like, I can't tell, right now, I'm a little bit pushing the Narnia books on my 13-year-old who had never read them, and I'm like, you just don't know what you're missing. And I have to keep reminding myself, do not do that, do not do that. He's like, I want to read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy for the 11th time. And that too, never discourage rereading. There's a reason why children reread, and they're really important aspects of rereading to the process of learning how to read, but also learning to love to read. So don't judge the kinds of books that kids are reading. A lot of boys don't want to necessarily read a novel. They want to read a joke book. They want to read a sports fact books. They're information seekers, many boys. And so they are often looking at books that don't feel like real books to some of us, but are. And they're often also more visual readers, so thus comic books. I read a lot of Peanuts. I read a lot of Archies. I liked the Betty and Veronicas more than the Jugheads, but it didn't prevent me from growing up to read Tolstoy or Toni Morrison, so it's not like that's going to hold them back. If they're enjoying it, then that is good. So you don't ever want to sort of throw down any kind of rules. Similarly, if your child is still in that process of learning to read and they're reading things that you think are too easy, like again, you just have to withhold the judgment because they are reading, they are choosing to read, and one of the things that we often get out of a reading experience is comfort, right? That's why like some of us will just reread books that we loved, or we'll read something that's very formulaic, like go through all the Agatha Christie's or some major series where you know what you're going to get and it's comforting. And sometimes kids want to read something that's easy or familiar or reread something because that's a comfort to them. I mean, there's a reason why, people will get very panicked. My child is stuck on Harry Potter and they will not get out and they're just staying there and they won't read anything, or Rick Riordan or whatever it is. And you worry, like, why is my child not moving on? It's because they're happy there. I mean, who wouldn't want to stay at Hogwarts? Like, I get it.
Right. And so, Captain Underpants, okay?
Captain Underpants is great. Captain Underpants, these books are really underestimated. There is that guy, first of all, anyone who can sell that number of books to that many kids, and kids who were not readers before, is a genius. It's genius. So you can't underestimate that. I think we often, I'm as big a literary snob as anyone else, but I really respect anyone who writes genre or popular fiction, because those are books that people want to read. And some of the smartest writers out there are writing in genre because, that is a real skill, to write books that people are drawn to.
And I'm glad you mentioned not being a book snob and judgmental. And I'm glad, because we have passed the time when we have to put a cover up the cover. What was that book about 50 Shades of Grey? There were so many people that were reading serendipitously, putting War and Peace, but they were really reading that. So don't be a snob with the kids. Dog Man, Captain Underpants, it's fine. They'll be okay. Now, you also, though, when you were talking about don't go too fast, have picture books that you've been writing now.
Yes. So one of the things that parents also worry about is my child isn't moving on to chapter books, or my child is supposed to be reading chapter books. They're that age, they can read them, but they still want to be read picture books at night. So they still want to look at picture books. So I have many things to say about that. You never grow out of picture books. Otherwise, there would be no Instagram, which is basically grown-up picture books. Many people are very visual, and picture books are an incredible art form. And there is a value, there's something that you get out of picture books that you don't get from a chapter book. There are many things. One of the things is that picture books are how children learn to read. So they are reading that picture book. While you're reading the words, they're reading the pictures. And really incredible illustrators know this. They're drawing another story in there. So every parent, I think, who's read aloud a picture book will have the experience of like reading the picture book and you're doing your voices and you're super into it and whatever. And it's something very serious you're reading. And the kid is like laughing. And you're like, why? Because there's something in the pictures. There's a different story. There's something else going on. And the other thing about picture books that's really fundamentally important is that they're written for parents to read, for adults to read. And so the vocabulary is much richer. The stories are often more complicated than in a chapter book. I mean, reading a beautiful picture book, and I'm going to throw out a really old title, but let's say reading Make Way for Ducklings, Robert McCloskey, so everyone knows that book. That's a lot more fun than reading like The Cat Sat on the Mat. So when you're learning how to read, the story that you're reading isn't exciting or intellectually rewarding in the way that a picture book is. And so those two processes, the picture book continues to be the carrot while they have to read those really boring early readers. And then the other thing I would say, well, I have many things to say about picture books.
But keep going.
The other thing about picture books is, and the reason why not to withdraw them when your child is learning to read chapter books, is that if you have been doing the right thing and reading to your child from babyhood, then that has become an incredible bonding and warm ritual, whether it's something that you do on Saturday mornings or something you always do before bedtimes. And I urge people not to just reserve reading time until bedtime for various reasons, one being that the child is tired, and probably so are you. But that's a very special bonding experience. That's a parent or a child or a caregiver with a child. And then if you say, well, now that you're reading on your own, I'm going to totally withdraw this nice fun thing, this ritual, it's like they're being punished for reading on their own. So you have to be very careful about, again, if you're trying to make reading into a positive experience, you really need to think about all of the messages that you're sending to a child. So one thing that we did with our kids when they were learning how to read, in order to sort of instill that idea of reading is a good thing, reading is the reward, is, every kid no kid wants to go to sleep. Unless they're really tired, in which case it's nerve-wracking when they say, like, I want to go to bed, because the kids want to stay up. So we made a rule that, okay, if bedtime is at 7, you need to go to sleep at 7, but if you want to stay up and read in bed quietly, you can stay up until 7:30. So then, for them, reading became it's a reward, it's a privilege, and it's something that you only get to do if you can and want to. And so what kid, again, doesn't want to stay up late, but it ends up becoming, oh, I don't want to, when your child says that they don't want to go to sleep yet, it's not, oh, can I have 5 more minutes? It's like, let me finish this chapter. And so you're putting it into their hands, giving them the control, but also giving them the sense that this is a privilege.
So you're creating a loving, warm environment around reading too, when you talk about comfort and
Yes.
bonding and all of this. That's not always what you get at school, even though it can be very helpful. I'm looking at Aaron's first kindergarten teacher here. So he turned out okay, and his mom. But that the job of the caregiver or the parent or the grandparent, and is to create this good feeling.
Yes.
Around reading.
Yeah, there's a lot in the book about creating an environment, like becoming a family of readers. And actually, since you mentioned boys, I'm going to go back to that because we didn't really touch on that. There's some really interesting statistics around boys, and it's very nice to have a writers' festival where there are lots of men here. But the statistics show that among adults, women read much more than men. And for better or for worse, the publishing industry knows this, and so it's a little bit of a vicious circle because the publishing industry is a business. They want to make money. If they know that there's more readers in women, they then cater more to women, so it's kind of a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy there. But there are lots of reasons why men read more than women, and a lot of it starts at a young age. So when you ask children who they see reading in their home, many more children say they see their mother reading to them. And they also say that their mother reads to them more. And so that is, and they don't see their fathers necessarily reading independently. So you really do have to model reading for your kids. It's, if you're sitting there scrolling on the phone and you're like, read the book, that's sending a little bit of a mixed message.
Well.
And actually, I will say one other thing. When you ask adults about who they read to, adults in surveys will say that they read more often to their girls than they do to their boys, and they admit that the men don't read as much. So it's not just, it's both sides observing this fact. And then I will say one last thing about boys, which is that, boys operate at a different developmental rate, and I think they eventually catch up with us. But
they're in the room.
Yes. But a lot of times, right, I mean, I have 2 sons and I have a daughter, and you think that when you're reading aloud to your son that he's not into it because he's like walking around the room and he's playing with things and he's doing it. That's just a boy. They're sometimes very kinetic. They need to get their energy out, but it doesn't mean they're not listening. It doesn't mean they're not appreciating. So what parents might do in those circumstances, they're like, oh, they're not into it. They close the book. They put it away. No, they're probably into it in their own way. And sometimes they move away, but then they come back. So you really do have to persist.
Boy, oh boy, that's something. Well, I want to shift, and afterwards, I hope people talk to you about your picture book because it's about reading, and there's a cat involved.
Yes.
You're a cat person.
I am on that
My
team.
first question to her when she was describing it was, "Are you going to have a dog in one of a picture book in the future?"
I have a pig in an upcoming picture book.
Oh, close
I'll
enough.
work towards the dog.
Close enough. Oh, well, now this book, though, really, I read it, well, it's one or two pages about the 100 things we've lost to the internet. And as a librarian, of course, one of the things was the card catalog, phone books. It's just really cool. Ex-boyfriends. 2 pages on that. The phone call, the phone in the kitchen. Oh, yes, that was one. Private humiliation. The Rolodex. I still have mine. Maps. When have you looked at a map? Handwritten letters. The record album. Emergency breakthrough. Remember in the old days? Who knows with that? Breakthrough. You break through on somebody's phone call, and they say it's an emergency, and you have to hang up. Sometimes you get other people to say that for you. Ignoring people, can't ignore them. They're always doing that. Knowing the number, telephone number, your checkbook, figuring out what the actor is in a movie. You're sitting there. One of my favorites, losing the instruction manual. A parent's undivided attention. And photo albums, and they're just wonderful. You just go through. But the first one that you have is boredom. Number 1, we've lost boredom. What did we lose?
Well, I that actually was the launch of the book because I had written an op-ed for the New York Times that the title was "Let Children Get Bored Again." But when I was working on it, I thought of it as the lost art of boredom, with that double entendre very much intended because. When you are, when we have, I don't have my phone on me, but I normally do at all times, like most people, and we call it a phone, right? But it's not a phone. It's a portable internet. And so because you have that on you, you have constant access to anything you would possibly want, to communication with someone, to entertainment, to information, to work, and to essentially everyone you know and everyone they know. And so there's never any reason to not entertain yourself, to not divert yourself, to not be productive, to not, we make it sound good, right? It's like you want to maximize all of your time. You want to, and we do this with our children. You want to optimize every moment. And so when you're walking to the train, as I do, I would often think, okay, I've got a 10-minute walk. What can I do during that 10 minutes? And I look at my portable internet and I'm like, I could listen to a podcast, I could listen to music, I could make a phone call, I could answer email. I'm very, very guilty of texting while walking, which is, I guess, called twalking. And I'm going to die that way.
Sounds like twerking.
Yeah, I know. It's probably not nearly as fun and probably more dangerous. So when you have that constant input, right, you don't have time to generate any output. You're constantly reacting to what's incoming. And the only time when you have your most creative thoughts, right? For me, it's in the shower because I don't have my phone, right? Or in the bath, I'll be like to my husband, "Can you bring a pad and pen because I'm having a thought and I'm in the bathtub?" Because that's the only time when you have the emptiness to be able to generate. You can't generate something new if you don't have, if you are constantly reacting to incoming information. So that's boredom, right? That's what boredom is. I mean, when we were growing up, by we, I mean like everyone under over maybe 40 here, like when you were in the back seat of the car, that was it. You were trapped. There was nothing to do. I remember like my thing to do was to look out and to weave my eyes in between the the dashes on the road. My parents would listen to music that I did not like, that I would like try to keep out, and you would just stare out the window or fight with your siblings, but like that was just empty time. And in the backseat of the car now, like everyone has their own little headset in, their own device, they're constantly occupied. And I do think that we are raising people to become less resourceful as a consequence, because they're not forced into those moments of empty time. So I think, and I see it for myself as well. As I said, like I'm as guilty of it, and as susceptible to it. So I do think that there is a purpose to boredom. And I also think that, people talk, especially now, like everyone's always worried about young people, including me. Are they growing up to be resilient and resourceful? Are they growing up to be able to manage frustration, to tolerate frustration? And a lot of that comes out of like those skills out of being bored, right? When you're bored, when things aren't handed to you, you have to create. That's where you become resourceful, and I think we're losing that. We're resilient, just tolerating boredom. I think one of the things you hear from teachers often is like the kids will not be engaged. We cannot engage them. We can't get their entertainment. And the antidote to that often is, well, then let's entertain them more. We'll do videos, we'll have interactive games, we'll use a smart board. But again, it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. It just worsens it, because at a certain point, you do need to learn to tolerate someone like me here talking on and on and on. And, maybe you drift off for a moment, but you have to learn to do that. And I would say too that it ties into reading, right? Because if you are used to getting that constant inflow of very fast information and entertainment and bite-sized chunks, you don't develop the sort of the ability to immerse yourself in a slower moving, longer narrative.
A book. Well, how did you compile the list? Because it's very nostalgic, and I started feeling very old. The Prince's phone was what got me. And being on it for an hour, picking your color, all of that.
So it started off with that boredom and essay, but I also, like many people, I'm sort of like raising my old man fist at the, at the internet, like it's doing all these terrible things, like imperiling democracy, and you can say all of there's a lot to say about what the internet is doing to society, to the truth, to the state of the world. And there are lots of people who are writing those books. And then there's lots of people who are sort of writing about like, well, how did we get here? How did this come to be? Let's sort of go back and dissect what the internet did to the news, for example, or to politics. And I thought, well, that is, so all that anger and all that kind of like TikTok, how did we get here? That's sort of been done. And I thought, we're always thinking very forward with the internet. We're always like constantly anticipating, like, what's this new app? Should I get it? I thought, let's pause for a moment and just kind of remember, what did we used to do before this, right? Like before you had the internet to just like look up on GPS, where you were going to go, like how did we get around, right? It's like there are certain things that,
Maps.
like, and getting lost is one of the lost things. So I thought, let's just try to kind of catalog all this and remember it for a couple of reasons. And for people who are of a certain age, it is nostalgic. For younger people, it's kind of like a discovery manual. Like we forget what children don't know, or just like teenagers. I remember, and this is not an internet thing, but it's a technology thing. You know how when you get a car, you have a couple of sets of keys, and there's that like one loser key that doesn't have the fob from the dealer, it's just the key. So I was going out to the car with my then 14-year-old daughter, and it was only the loser key left. Like, I don't know where the other ones were. And I brought it out and I opened up the car with a key, and she was just dumbstruck. She's like, "You can open up a car with a key?" Like, I had no idea, you know? So it's like important to remember, like, all these things that are obvious to us are like not obvious to kids.
That happened it was a young man that came to film the card catalog at the Library of Congress. It's now in the basement. And we have the card catalog book, and he was about 26. And we're standing there, and then he said, "Well, how does it work?" I said, "Well, you open the drawer, and there are these little cards." And just the look on his face, like, whoa. And you have so many of these.
I mean, one of the things about the card catalog, so like when I was writing it, it was hard to, I had like, 227, I got it down to 169, so I cheated. Like each chapter has like 3 or 4 or 5 things
I
kind of in
noticed
and
that.
around a theme. So one of the things about a card catalog, a few things. One is I do have a card catalog, and it's our huge like whatnot drawer, basically. Like here's where the batteries are, so you open it up. And my husband one year got me a gift, guess you can get them online, of old card catalog cards. So I use them as note cards and bookmarks and things like that. But one of the things you lose with the card catalog is that sense of discovery. And that often happens with physical objects. A related thing is the newspaper, which I'll talk about that in a second. But with the card catalog, right, you go in there with intention, like I'm going to look for this book, but then you, as you're flipping, you're seeing other books. And you're like, oh, that looks kind of cool. Like, that's interesting. And so you discover things that you do in a physical space in a way that you don't when everything is digitized. And I was sitting last night at dinner next to someone who was saying, she uses a Kindle, and I was like, well, what are you reading? And she's like, oh, God, I don't know. Like, what's the title? What's the name? And it's because she's using a Kindle, and I'm not trying to bash a Kindle, even though I would never use it in a million and one years. But one of the things you lose is you lose the sense of like a physical landscape, right? Because when you have a physical book, you are either buying it, you're taking it out from the library, it's an object, you like there's a trajectory, maybe you ordered it online, you remember opening the box, maybe you went to a bookstore, and then you put it in a certain place in your house. So there are all these cues that you lose, including the cover. I mean, that's an interesting thing within the publishing industry because they pay a lot of attention to what the cover looks like. But on the Kindle, like you're not really seeing those covers, and you don't really have a sense. And once you've downloaded it, like it's effectively just like another file on your computer. And how often do we go through those? So it's that physical landscape. And similarly, with the newspaper, right? Part of the great thing about opening up a broadsheet newspaper is like you start a story on page 1 and you jump and you end up somewhere and you notice like, oh, there's this interesting photo here and it's about an uprising in, I don't know, say Tunisia, and you weren't intending to read about Tunisia, but the photo caught your eye, the headline was interesting, suddenly now you're in Tunisia, you didn't expect to be reading about that. And so the newspaper exposes us to this, the physical newspaper, to this much broader world than you get if you are just searching and sort of going very intentionally down your rabbit hole, or you've like just subscribed to a newsletter and so you're getting a certain kind of information, and that extends to also getting a certain kind of point of view. And increasingly, of course, the news online is personalized too. So you might not even realize, like, I am just never getting, like, this website understands that I am not interested in, let's say, Nigeria. So it's no longer delivering me any news about Nigeria. But again, that just leads to a narrowing of our perspective. So to me, it's very interesting that the internet is supposed to open up this big world to us. And in some ways it does. But in a lot of other ways, it really does sort of take you down a very narrow path.
They just told me that we have to stop
Oh,
because we could keep going. So, but that we have time for a few questions though, or comments, if someone would like to raise their hand. Oh, come on.
How long has it been since you picked up a dictionary or read a map? I love to read maps. I don't read maps anywhere because you don't need a map. When we used to travel, I loved planning ahead. I pick on, oh, look this. That's gone.
Yeah, so in case people didn't hear, she asked about maps and dictionaries. And again, I'm going to go back to how to raise a reader because a dictionary is the most amazing thing for a kid. Even if you think like, oh, but they can use the Google dictionary or whatever they're using on the computer. Get your kid a huge dictionary and stick it in their room and an atlas. And I have to tell you, like the quality of atlases is so beautiful. One thing about the internet, I will say that's positive, is it's forced publishing to compete. And the quality of the images in an atlas is amazing. And so again, it lays out that whole world. So I will say my youngest child does have a big old Merriam-Webster dictionary in his room, and he'll just sit there and again, it's that boy information seeking kind of reading. He will just look up words. The And a map is another really interesting thing too, because again, remember when we all had, like you had the fold-up maps, they were in the pocket of the car
do.
door, right? And you could never figure out how the hell to refold it, right?
That is a problem.
But I do think that, we are losing a kind of a spatial literacy when it's sort of hard to get a lay of the land if you're just following the map on Siri and like what the hell happens when you lose your signal, right? So part of why I wanted to write the book too was there's the nostalgia thing, there's the manual thing, but one of the larger points is that the internet really is, like everything else, it's a money-making operation. It's a bunch of products and services that are being sold to us, and some of them are quote-unquote free, even though we know that they're stealing our soul and our data and other things like that. But it's our choice as customers to choose, like, do I want this thing? We don't have to do it. No one's forcing us to participate. Like, I have decided I am not doing Zelle or PayPal or what's the other one? There's like Venmo. I'm out. Like I'm done. I'm just not going to download those apps. I'm not doing it. I mean, what I think about when I'm looking at a new app or a new website, I'm like, am I okay with where I am now? Like, why do I feel the need to upgrade this idea that's been sold to us that like the internet is the future? That is a marketing message that we have all absorbed. Like if someone said to you, like, this kind of jean is the future. Like you need to go back to the low-waisted. We went to the high-waisted. We're back at the low-waisted. And you're like, I don't care. Like it doesn't look good on me. Like you don't believe every one of those marketing messages. Why do I think we are a little bit still too credulous in terms of thinking like that somehow we're dragging our heels into the 21st century if we say no to something online.
Say no to bell bottoms. I trip now.
Oh, well, so he asked what I'm reading. I am reading, goes to the Narnia thing. I'm in a book club we only read children's literature, and it's interesting. It's the only book club that I would ever be in because I really like to choose what I want to read. Like I don't want to have to read some crappy book that someone else in the club suggested. But with kids' books, it's kind of, I'm sorry, it's a low lift because the books are really short and easy. So I was like, I can do this one. So I've been in this club since 2008, and we are reading The Silver Chair, which is, depending on how you count the order. There's a little controversy over the order. It's one of the books in the Narnia series, which is kind of why I want my youngest to read along with me. But my next book is going to be Hernan Diaz's Into the Distance. If any of you have read Trust, I thought that was one of my favorite books from last year, and this is his first book.
Book club.
So I raised 3 boys. Not one of them is a reader, but I have to tell you, one is now the director of
I was going to say,
library.
yeah, he's the director of this whole festival, Aaron.
So don't think that they won't be surrounded by books at some point in their life.
Yay.
Are audiobooks not reading?
I think audiobooks absolutely are reading, and I
Yes.
think audiobooks are a
Yes.
huge gift. And to get back to how to raise a reader, I think particularly for kids who are dyslexic,
Yes.
or have a visual issue or any other challenge to reading physical books, audiobooks are an incredible gift. And one of the great things about audiobooks, particularly for young people with a challenge in reading, is that in the same way that reading aloud a picture book is that carrot, right? While they're really struggling to learn how to read themselves, audiobooks is able to provide, a level that they're at intellectually and creatively and emotionally of storytelling that they can't get through reading on their own.
And think about too, instead of saying, okay, it's a reading disability, dyslexia, it's a reading difference. People read differently, they hear differently, and everything. So you're more of a visual reader. You're more of a oratory reader.
And I also think, they're an art form, audiobooks. The narration can be incredible. And
yeah.
and I do think that, honestly, some of us have an auditory challenge or difference, and listening to audiobooks is a really good way to force yourself to learn to be a better and more attentive listener.
And a story. You're hearing a story, and it's wonderful, and it takes you away and makes you exercise better. Yeah. Okay, one more.
Children get to be millennials. You'll adopt Venmo because that's all they do.
Okay, one of the things we've lost is having actual paper money in your wallet.
My daughter complained, $27 for 50 checks? You've got to be kidding me. Who needs checks?
The checkbook is a chapter in the book.
It's a whole chapter. So thank all of you. Thank you, Pamela.
Thank
we really
you.
appreciate it.